we are going to move on to my conversation with Najib, beginning with how technology has impacted the value of knowledge in consulting.
And that's where the landscape has really changed, right, is because of technology. So it used to be, knowledge was king, right? I have specialty knowledge in marketing communication that nobody else has, and you're going to pay me to access that, right? But that's no longer the case. We all have the same relative knowledge at our fingertips with smartphones and computers. So that's where now the value added comes in, right? And that's where, even for a business like mine, which is, a small boutique firm, the competition's really changed, right? I'm competing with, in solo individuals working from home. I'm competing with university students. I'm competing with large multinational firms, right? We've all kind of now entered into this mishmash of competition where 10 years ago, it was, me and maybe a handful of my competitors who are of similar size that competed for the same business. Sometimes I got it, sometimes they got it. But now, more often than not, I'm, losing business or gaining business from people I've never heard of, right? So because now the client has a different ask. Before it was just to access our knowledge and expertise. And now, more often than not, there's different price points for that, right? If I'm a client who says, I don't have a big budget, all I need is to find, some information on this aspect of my business, why not just hire a university student to do that research and analysis? What do I need to pay Najib for, right? So what does Najib bring to the table, with his experience and background is the analytical piece of it, the problem solving piece of it. Based on my experience, my knowledge, my expertise, I can add that value add is that, yes, maybe you can find out this information on the internet, but really I have the experience that actually makes sense of it and I can apply it to your business. Knowledge is the how, wisdom is the why. And I think more and more people are looking for the why. They're looking for the wisdom that comes with years of experience so that they can circumvent the potential pitfalls or obstacles that might come if they try to do it themselves. That they're willing to pay for is, can Najib help me from making mistakes that might cost me money?
Something that we talked about before is that kind of the problems that your clients are facing is changing. So it might not just be, we want to make this as efficiently as possible, but now we need to create this product and bring it into people's lives in this very non-invasive, but very easy manner. And so with that kind of shift in the problems that businesses are facing, what skills have become very important in dealing with those problems and solving those problems for your clients?
I think more and more often, creative skills, critical analysis skills, problem solving, writing, right? Predictive skills are all something that are going to continue to be high in demand. David Epstein in his book Range talks about, it's been quite a while now that computers could beat human beings at chess, for example, right? So, there's not going to be too much demand for chess champions anymore because more often than not, any machine learning AI piece of software is going to be able to beat the grand chess champion of the world, right? The one thing that computers are a long way away from, machines are a long way away from, is understanding why we play chess, right? So they may understand how we play chess and be able to outflank us in playing chess, but they're a long way, until we reach singularity, I guess, they're a long ways away from figuring out why. So at the end of the day, this is why more and more businesses aren't looking at the degree that students have when they bring them in. I see more and more, myself included, I could care less if it's a business student, right? I look at poli-sci students, anybody from social sciences, humanities, even arts, right? Because these people are creative thinkers. And what I want now is multidisciplinary workforce in my office, people from different backgrounds, education, experience, that can get together and help me solve a problem creatively and look at it critically. Now, the issue is on the learning side is that we don't actually make that easy, right? In our universities, we don't make it easy to put people into the workforce that have that multidisciplinary background. To me, like more often than not, we should encourage students, no matter what faculty. There may be the concept of faculty should be limited altogether, right? Because what's going to happen with students who learn in traditional learning environments, you're not competing with people who are learning online. So online today, I might take a course in AI. Tomorrow I might take a course in business. Next week I might take a course in law, right? So I'm becoming multidisciplinary. And the interesting thing, I think, is what's happening is that, this whole conversation about who's more valuable, a generalist or a specialist. And my answer to that is both. What we want is people who are multidisciplinary in nature. They have a good, broad understanding of many, many things and different sciences, different disciplines, different from the humanities, arts, business. But we want them to be able to apply to a specific problems, right? So we want specialists, but we want them to have multidisciplinary background. We no longer want the person who, was just in political science for 10 years to work in our political firm, right? We want people who have a lot of different areas of applied learning to bring that into our businesses. There's a tradition in our office that every Friday afternoon, we would all leave our desks, just around 1, 2 o'clock. And then in the afternoon, we would get together, good food, and all sit around and we would talk. And sometimes, it was, one person would pose a philosophical question to the group, and we would all answer it. Like, could be something like, what keeps you awake at night? You know what I mean? And the idea of that was, this is how you get to know each other better, right? I mean, you can sit next to somebody day after day, week after week, year after year, and not know anything about them. That is actually very possible in our current working environments, right? Never mind if people are working from home, right? You know nothing about them. Yeah, you might know how many kids they have and their interests and things, but really knowing how they think and what they care about. So that was one of the things we would do, is just pose philosophical questions to each other and talk and share that way. The other thing we would do is we would pose to the group a internal problem or a client problem that we haven't been able to solve. So now the idea here was that a group of people from different experience, different backgrounds, different disciplines has a higher chance of solving a problem than people who are homogenous in terms of their backgrounds and experience. And it never failed. I can't think of a single high tea, maybe it took 2 high teas, but I can't think of a single one where we didn't solve that problem for the client or for ourselves, because that's the power of a group of people with differing backgrounds when they approach, and also fresh thinking as well, right? The power of fresh thinking as well.
So I wanted to ask you about the attitudes that you think are important for people to hold in consulting. And you mentioned a couple to me last time that I thought would be really good for people to hear, because they helped me understand management consulting better.
One of the things that I really find with students these days is just there's such a rush for everything, right? And that's the environment that we live in, right? I mean, we live in the immediate gratification environment, and also, learning. Our approach to learning is that way as well. In the book Range that I talked about earlier, he talks about the benefits of slow learning and how we've lost that value in society, right? Where people used to take years and decades to learn their disciplines. And now, we read a few articles, we do an online course, and, it goes up on LinkedIn, expert, right? Expert, guru, thought leader, because I've done a couple of courses in whatever subject, right? So we're such a hurry to earn these badges, the whole fake it till you make it kind of culture that we have, that we see in social media platforms, especially like LinkedIn, that we don't really put an emphasis and value on slow learning and understanding of the thing that, you should be learning your whole life. There's a great documentary on the sushi maker in Japan that I always talk about, and I love it, right? Because the father, the master sushi maker, is in his 80s, right? And he has, a Michelin-starred sushi restaurant, and he talks about the fact that he feels like he's just learning like what sushi really is. He's making sushi his whole life. His son is still an apprentice. He's in his 50s. And he talks about how like one day he wants to be, a master sushi maker. He's in his 50s. He's been making sushi for like 40 years. We don't spend 4 days learning something before we think we're experts, right? Sometimes learning things, and it's also how we push our children too. Now that I have a young daughter, I see, the temptation to accelerate her learning, right? Like, oh my goodness, she's going to be left behind. Oh my goodness, like I'm not exposing her to enough things. And, we don't value play. We don't, again, value that experiential learning, And it's the same thing in our universities, right? We don't put any emphasis on just reflection. Like, why isn't there just why isn't there a course just called reflection, that everybody has to take, is where, one time a week you stop and you think about everything you've learned, that week, and you try to apply it to different scenarios, right? You're given different scenarios to apply what you've learned that week, and just reflect on what you've learned and what you've learned well and what you haven't, right? Again, people would say that's, hippy dippy thinking, but I don't really think it is. As we focus on things like, a big part of compassion is self-reflection. A big part of compassion is self-compassion and self-care, right? And meditation and all these kinds of things, right? As we realize the power of these things, I think we need to incorporate those in our formal education environments as well. So I just think that, this ability to slow down and understand that no one expects you, to be an expert when you enter their business fresh out of school. That this is your time to learn. This is your chance to ask all the stupid questions that you may not want to be able to ask later. More often than not, I get these young, passionate, A-type personalities that immediately, want to show me and the client everything they know. And it's just a huge opportunity to just listen. And active listening, this is the other thing too. Like, we're such poor listeners. More and more, I can probably count on one hand how many people I know that I would say are good listeners. The idea of active listening, I think, is so important and has to be revisited and retaught to society, right? To act, and again, this we have our cognitive bias, we have our cognitive dissonance that our algorithms allow us to feed into, right? So we have to actually struggle to really, really actively listen and critically think, right? Actively listening means I repeat back to you what I think I understand of what you're saying, right? So that you and I both feel like I understand. In psychology, you brought up psychology, same thing, right? You're never going to get over a person's psychological or mental block if you don't at first try to attempt to understand what their issue is, right? And you have to listen to that and make sure that you are hearing what they are saying. We never take the time. It's always assumption, right? I understand what that person is trying to say, and they're wrong, and this is why they're wrong, and we're such a hurry to counter that argument, right? We live in an environment of contrarians, right? Not in an environment of people who seek to understand.
You talked a little bit before about how the industry is changing and things are becoming a little bit more competitive, and now clients might be okay with maybe paying less for services from people who can't give more, versus paying for somebody that's more expensive who could potentially give more value. So what is the type of attitude that might be important to have when you're entering into an industry like this that might be increasing in competitiveness, especially because of the shifts that are happening because of COVID?
I think, one of the things that people don't understand is that as a consultant, my whole life is fighting fires. That is the nature of the work. Somebody is paying me to solve their problem or alleviate their pain, right? So if you don't like fighting fires, you don't want to become a consultant. Whether you're fighting those fires internally in your own office, in your own work, or doing it for clients, that is essentially the job. So if you're not comfortable with, fast-moving environments that require a lot of problem solving, removing of obstacles, critical thinking, being creative, finding meaning in things, you're not going to like being a consultant, because that's the entire job. Now, after the pandemic and lockdowns ease up and things like that, and people get back to it, I think that more and more, the opportunity to slow down will be there. I think people will ask or give you more time to come up with better solutions to their problem. Whether you're designing a product or a service, I think we're starting to see, the negative effects of those, fast to rise tech unicorns, for example, like Uber and Airbnb. I mean, Airbnb has become very evident, what are the negative effects of that platform that everybody thought was so glorious to begin with, but in terms of what it's done to housing prices and the ability for low-income people to purchase houses, for examples, or even what it's done in terms of people who were over-leveraged in owning all of these properties that they rented out to people, and what that's done for them, right? Uber, another thing, right? Uber and the creation of the gig economy and the freelance driver and the eroding of worker rights, right? So I think that people are going to be more and more open to taking the time to think things through before just getting caught up in the the shininess and the newness of the technology or whatever innovation has been put out there. So I'll give you a good example. So human-centered design is a big part, in my industry and a lot of industries right now, and it has been, for probably the last decade, maybe even longer, right? We've been using it for about the last decade. So the idea of like, when you're designing solutions and processes, you do it with human beings in mind. How will the human being use it, versus like, what's the cheapest or economical or the fastest way to do it, right? Which used to be the industrial way of looking at things. But now, then human-centered design came along and said, okay, well, no, let's think about how humans are really going to use it and what's the best, most efficient way for humans to use it. But now, what the new thing that is coming out is speculative design, right? Because now the problem with even human-centered design is that we are not the center of the universe. You know what I mean? Human beings aren't, and even like, people talking about humans and nature, we are nature. We keep forgetting that. I mean, just because we're enlightened doesn't mean that we're not a part of nature. If anything, it should be more evident now how integral human beings are with nature, right? And the effects, right? So the idea of speculative design is that now we design things and we build things with the idea of what that impact is. What is the societal impact? What is the moral impact? What is the values-driven result of what I'm doing? So, if I knew now, if I was launching Airbnb, what might be the societal impact, maybe I would do it differently, right? If I was using speculative design versus human-centered. From a human-centered design perspective, if I'm looking at it, Airbnb is a great concept, right? Allowing people to make passive income, right? Leveling the playing field a little bit in terms of being able to earn money, right? And same with Uber as well. But now I look at it from a speculative design aspect and think of what the societal impact should be. Even the question of should I do this and what if I do this becomes a totally different approach. The idea of, it used to be like cradle to grave thinking in terms of product making, right? My background's in consumer packaged goods, so we always thought about cradle to grave, like we make this thing and then, where does it end up, right? But now it's cradle to cradle, right? So now we should be thinking about products of like, what is the new life of this product, right? So, shoemakers are really embracing this. Consumer goods companies are really embracing this. So if I make a shoe, what happens to that shoe after the first person uses it? What becomes its new life? Can it have a new life, or does it just end up in a landfill? And I don't want it to end up in a landfill because I know the environmental aspects of it. So what can happen to the shoe? Can it be recycled? Can it be used for something else? Can it even be a shoe that in this idea of built-in obsolescence, making products obsolete? Maybe I design the shoe to become obsolete as a shoe, but it can be used for something else, right? And be done by the user and not have to, be brought back to a manufacturer or shredded or taken back down to its components and rebuilt and recycled. So this whole idea, I think, of looking at things now with the desirable outcomes in mind, and how can we change habits? How can we look at changing consumption and changing behavior when we do put our products and services out in the world, rather than just consuming and producing for the sake of it. We're not just trying to put more garbage in the world, right? Whether that, garbage is a product or a service, we're trying to actually do things and work on things that provide meaningful outcomes in people's lives. Now, that's all not always achievable, but at least with that thinking at the outset, we might have a different outcome.
I hear a lot of discourse between some people who think that, this is going to be a permanent change because now like corporations and companies are going to be waking up and they're going to want to maintain this. And then other people who are like, well, as soon as we start going back to work and life goes back to normal, things will just go back to how they once were. So are you saying that you are seeing that things might actually be shifting into a permanent change? Or do you think that we might kind of go back to this normal to how we once were before?
As somebody who's worked on change management their whole career, first of all, people are very reluctant to change. People fear change. They don't embrace change easily. It'd be a different world if that wasn't the case, right? So one of the things that you have to do for people is to step change. And I think it's the same thing with all of these ideas that people have in terms of what's going to happen post-pandemic, right? First of all, it hasn't been long enough to really caused true systemic change. It just hasn't. All it took was a couple months of change in our lives and behaviors to change outcomes of how we behave in society in normal conditions. It would, again, be a much different world. That's not how human beings work. That's not how the world works. So if we really want to have some of the changes that we think are needed now, that we've seen the negative effects of our societies and the poor social constructs that we have and the poor social supports that we have for the most vulnerables, we need systemic change in a way of thinking. That speculative design concept, we're in a bubble, right? So people, who think that, oh, I could have done my job. This is the funniest thing I always hear, is like, I could have done my job from home. Really? Is your job right now the same as it was day to day? Is there the same demand of your times? Is there the same amount of people asking for your time? Are there the same amount of time management issues and project management issues as in normal? Of course there isn't, right? Most people have experienced a very less demanding work schedule than they had before, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It's silly to think that just because you're able to do it for the last few weeks that you're always going to be able to do it. Now, I think one of the big things that we should look at as employers is, just like we customize many things in our businesses for individuals, we need to customize the hiring experience as well, right? I think that more time has to be spent when you hire people to understand how they like to learn and how they like to work, right? Rather than assuming that, someone's background and their experience makes them great for the job, I think we need to spend more time, say, figuring out, is this a audible learning person? Is this a face-to-face learning and interacting person, and understanding, things like introversion and extroversion
Mm-hmm.
and all of these psychological traits and behaviors that are important. I think that should determine whether or not a person is a work from home employee or a work at the office employee, right? And then set up your office accordingly, right? If you really feel like you need half your staff to be the type of person that really thrives working from home, then you only need half the office space, because then hire those people that thrive at working from home and have the responsibility and discipline to work from home. And then, but you'll still need an office for the other people who actually thrive in team environments and seeing people all the time and socializing, right? So rather this, again, we've been through this cycle so many times in our work environments, right? It's like open space versus closed space, cubicles, and the reason why this is all cyclical is because we never actually address the true problem. Again, speculative design, right? Is like, what if I hire this person and they don't like working in an office, but I'm not set up to let them work from home, right? What if, we don't ask these questions? And I think those are the kinds of things that we need to start talking about. Is not, are we going to have like this utopian environment now that, for a few weeks we were all inconvenienced? It's a silly way of thinking at it. If decades and decades of obvious inequality and inequity and intolerance, we've seen it, hasn't changed us, do you really think a few weeks of it is going to?
Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of GMCA Podcast. Make sure to catch the next episode where Jason will be discussing recruitment and the process of beginning a career as a consultant.